listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
The U.S. is sending troops to Peru. The leaders of the Uhuru movement are speaking out, and the New York Times acknowledges Nazis in Ukraine. Joining us to discuss these stories and more, Dr. Gerald Horne, professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
This is a critically important story. Orinoco Tribune says the African People's Socialist Party chairman Omali Yeshitela condemns U.S. repression and exposes false Russian connection in an exclusive interview. Dr. Horne, your thoughts?
Well, I'm happy to see that this interview has seen the light of day because Omali raises very profound and important points. I think we need to realize that this attack upon him and the African People's Socialist Party is part and parcel of a wider effort to circumscribe the ability of Black Americans to seek allies on the international scene. Although historians have not well acknowledged this point, the fact of the matter is that because of the heinous and atrocious atrocities visited upon Black Americans historically, we have been forced to seek allies abroad, be it revolutionary Haiti in the 19th century or Mexican revolutionaries in the second decade of the 20th century or the Soviet Union. Black nationalists were seeking allies in Tokyo in the 1920s and the 1930s. Of course, there's a relationship with the rising Africa and Caribbean in the 1950s and the 1960s. And so obviously, there are powerful forces in Washington who would like to stymie that particular initiative, and that is the import of this impending prosecution, this spurious prosecution, indeed, of Chairman Omali and his African People's Socialist Party.
Do you have any insight into the logic behind the U.S. State Department or the U.S. Department of so-called Justice picking this fight in the first place? Because I don't think I'm wrong to say that the African People's Socialist Party is not on the top 5 of most African Americans, let alone Americans' list of organizations to pay attention to. But they have, through these attacks, elevated Omali, Chairman Yeshitela, in the minds of a lot of people. So why pick this fight in the first place?
Well, I think for many reasons. One, it brings us back to the old saw that you only have to beat one enslaved person to keep the entire plantation in line. And so giving a beat down to the African People's Socialist Party is a shot over the bow to any Black Americans who sometime in the 21st century might seek to walk in their footsteps and perhaps broker an alliance with a rising China, for example. Secondly, I think that you should put the attack on Chairman Omali and his party in the context of the split in the U.S. ruling elite with regard to how to ensure the hegemony of U.S. imperialism. As we've noted many times previously, the Biden faction and the Democratic Party faction would like to take on Russia and China simultaneously. The Trumpista faction seemingly wants to cut a deal with Moscow and then focus like a laser beam on China. Since we know that it's the Biden faction that presently controls the Justice Department, it should not surprise us at all that any who supposedly would seek friendship with Moscow or seek friendship with Russia and question this escapade, this failing escapade indeed in the Ukraine, would be subject to persecution and prosecution. So at the end of the day, I think that this attack on Chairman Omali and his party, it's utterly explicable.
The New York Times reports Nazi symbols on Ukraine's front lines highlight thorny issues of history. Troops' use of patches bearing Nazi emblems risk fueling Russian propaganda and spreading imagery that the West has spent a half century trying to eliminate. Apparently, they've been trying to eliminate the imagery, but apparently they've been trying to foster the growth of the ideology that is represented by that imagery in Ukraine. Dr. Horne.
Well, I have to say that I was taken aback by that article, as I'm oftentimes taken aback when a bit of truth creeps into the pages of the New York Times. Certainly, I would hope that there are many who are outraged by the fact that our tax dollars are going into the same pocket as those who would hold fascism and Nazism dear. Certainly, it helps to underscore the point that Moscow made in February 2022 at the onset of the special military operation that a particular project was to denazify the Ukraine. And that, of course, includes the notorious Azov Battalion, which is mentioned in the context of this article. But I think that we all should be concerned that there is this effort to deodorize and sanitize fascism. Recall that just a few days ago, the New York Times reported the story that has escaped the attention of other organs and other communications outlets, of course, Sputnik accepted, which is that when you had this invasion of Russian territory, once again, it was by neo-Nazi elements, and once again, they were equipped with U.S. military materiel. We should not necessarily be overly shocked by this. We know that in order to maintain its hegemony, U.S. imperialism will seek alliances with fascists. That has been its notorious history, seeking alliances with death squads in Latin America, with these ultra-religious zealots in Afghanistan who ultimately came into conflict with U.S. imperialism after they collaborated against the Soviet Union from about 1977 up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So once again, I think that we should all be outraged, and it should give further impetus to our felt desire to deliver peace, an anti-fascist, anti-Nazi peace indeed, to the Ukraine.
I find a paragraph in this article to be interesting because they talk about that it's Russian propaganda that has been promoting this imagery, and that Russia has falsely declared Ukraine to be a Nazi state, a claim that he's used to justify his illegal invasion. So one of the real elements of this story seems to be, some of these soldiers wearing these patches doesn't really serve them well, because all it does is provide further fuel for propaganda that the Ukraine is actually a Nazi state.
Well, obviously that was a disingenuous statement by the journalists who penned these words. But I think it's people beyond the United States who should be concerned about this troubling development. Recall that during the heyday of the fascists and the Nazis in the early 1940s, Poland was a particular target of their infamy. Likewise, when we notice that Henry Kissinger suggests that Ukraine should be invited into NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, because of the arming of Washington, it now has one of the most powerful militaries on the European continent. That also presents not only a mortal danger and threat to Russia, I would imagine that it presents a mortal danger and threat to Ukraine's non-Russian neighbors as well. Indeed, it presents a mortal danger and threat to Central Europe, generally speaking. So I would hope that this article is given the kind of attention worldwide that it is receiving on Radio Sputnik.
And here's an interesting article that we'd like to get your thoughts on from South America. What is behind the entry of U.S. troops and weapons into Peru after a very interesting change of power at the top that the U.S. seems to have had some input in? Now troops are coming in after they lose Colombia. Is Peru the new Colombia? Dr. Horne.
Well, once again, we should be disturbed by this story. Recall that it comes in the wake of a very profoundly important meeting that took place in Brazil just days ago, where leaders of South American nations gathered under the leadership of President Lula of Brazil, a social democrat. And obviously, President Lula of Brazil is coming into conflict with U.S. imperialism because he is a leader, if not the founder, of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which is once again threatening the hegemony of U.S. imperialism. He has refused to sign on to the sanctions crusade against his BRICS partner. Speaking of Russia, the top trading partner of Brazil is China, thousands of miles away, and not its northern neighbors, speaking of the United States of America. And with the dislodging of President Castillo in Lima, Peru, and the rise of this anti-sovereign dictatorship, if you like, in Lima, once again, we have noticed the conspicuous absence of any editorial denunciations of this disturbing development. We await, although I don't think we should expect, denunciations from the State Department of this disturbing development. And once again, it suggests what the opening story implies, which is that in order to maintain its flagging domination and hegemony, the United States will ally with the most odious forces and the most odious figures, rhetoric and propaganda about democracy and human rights set aside.
As we understand, one of the results of U.S. intervention in spaces like this is an increase in access to drugs in the United States. Can we expect to see a rise in amounts of marijuana and cocaine and possibly fentanyl that find their ways from the shores of Peru to the west coast of the United States?
Most likely you will. And if there is a futures market in those drugs, you might want to monitor the prices because they're probably already reflecting an impending flood and influx of controlled substances, not only into the West Coast, but throughout the United States of America. And therefore, this points up another issue, which is that the people of the United States, not least the poor and working class of the United States, are the ultimate victims, although not the sole victims, of U.S. imperialist hegemony, because our interests are routinely sacrificed in order to maintain the bloody and brutal domination of U.S. imperialism.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, a historian, and a researcher.